Hello dear viewers, in this short video we will take a look at 5 features of narrative design in Metro Exodus, the game developed by 4A Games and published by Deep Silver in 2019. So to start with, the game consists of 3 different types of levels that alternate with each other. The first type is levels where a player has minimal freedom of exploration and moves through relatively straightforward corridors, and so the narrative during those levels approximates movement along some predefined rails. Well, often quite literary rails. The gameplay on these levels resembles that in Call of Duty or in many similar first-person shooters. You may use different combat tactics to get through such a level, but that only impacts the pace. The pace itself is generally quite fast and serves for building pressure, which is also emphasized by lines from other characters, who constantly urge the player to move further because of some imminent threat. A good example is the level of Novosibirsk, where main characters have to act promptly because of the high level of radiation there. The second type is open levels, where the player is given much more freedom of exploration. This is where the gameplay approaches that seen in Fallout or the Elder Scrolls franchises. Though on such levels you actually still don't have control over the course of events, it is you who decides where to go first, and visiting some areas is optional. Open levels are the only type where the player can make decisions that influence the plot. If you make wrong decisions, your team will lose some members, and that in turn defines the final ending of the game. And this is an interesting idea, because whereas corridor levels create their pressure by fast pacing, open levels force you to make impactful decisions, thus creating the pressure of responsibility. There is also a third type of levels where you're just wandering around your little train. There are no enemies or challenges. Those levels tell you more about characters, drive the plot one step further, and serve the purposes of exposition. Also, they allow you to refresh past events in your memory and provide you with some respite between more intense levels. The gameplay during those chapters resembles rather an interactive movie experience. Of course, changing of the level types provides a player with some rest. So after a highly dynamic, high-gear rush of a corridor level, you are glad to explore an open level on your own pace. But when you gradually start to get bored during an open world chapter, you are then presented with a new corridor level, where the plot develops again much faster. And while you are sitting in a cozy comfort of the train, the looming necessity of getting into a hostile area at some point in the future looks especially disturbing. You might say that this level type sequence is rather a feature of the game or level design and has nothing to do with narrative design, but I would say that it is not exactly so. While on all 3 types of levels you don't really have control of the course of events, the rate of events is dramatically different. And so different types of narrative techniques suit those different types of gameplay. So, how can you arrange different game levels to facilitate different narrative purposes? The game Metro Exodus starts with a corridor level, so that fast and dramatic development of the plot can capture the attention of players right from the start. In the podcast How They Make Games, issue 251, the developers from 4A Games mentioned that starting the game with a corridor level allowed to familiarize new players with the setting and explain the state of events at the start of the game. Similarly, developers used a corridor level for the final chapter because, as again stated in the same podcast, otherwise it would be difficult to reach the necessary degree of dramatic tension at the climax of the story. Generally, usage of a corridor level at the most crucial points of the story ensures that players don't miss any essential pieces of the narrative. This game introduces a very minimal interface to a player. Your equipment, like the map, electric charger, binoculars, are all represented as physical objects. In the standard difficulty mode, information displayed to the player is stripped to a bare minimum, and even that is hidden by default. The same logic applies to most of the interaction you have with the game world. When you take a look at the landscape in front of you from a vantage point, all you see are the physical objects. No markers, no pointing arrows, no highlighted borders or similar things. This is unlike, let's say, in the Elder Scrolls Skyrim, where you constantly see markers on your compass. In Assassin's Creed, you even see direct markers just on top of objects of interest, like locations or NPCs. In Metro Exodus, you have some signs on your map, true, but no further information is provided by the map than the bare location of a place. You have to remember all the data you receive, and thus the game encourages attention while listening, as there is no interface mechanic for scripted dialogue in the game. You just approach an NPC and he or she starts talking or acting in some way. Again, there are no interface elements to notify you that the interaction has started. And the listening is important, for you might receive some directions on an object of interest from a character while simply standing near that character. And that information, usually seasoned with rumors and uncertain guesses, is never repeated twice. There is no journal with notes, unless, well, you keep your own notes on some real-life piece of paper while playing the game. The same logic also applies for the whole side quest system in this game. For instance, in the Volga level, a little girl asks you to bring back her teddy bear, which has been supposedly taken to a lair of the beast called Demon. Then a mark appears on your map, and that's it. You've just received a quest, but no indication appears on the interface to let you know about that. Similarly, no indication appears anywhere on the interface when you eventually bring back the toy. And in this way, the game pushes you to pay attention to what you hear, or even overhear, because there always might be a nugget of important information amidst a seemingly nonchalant talk. Therefore, in order to distinguish more important information from less important, the player has to process carefully everything they receive. In this way, by interspersing gameplay-related information with pure narrative exposition, the game design motivates players to remain perceptive to the game lore. And, as is well known, making players more familiar with the lore and setting of the game usually improves the immersion and therefore enhances the overall experience. There is no single location without a story attached to it, or at least, well, I believe so. The game follows a philosophy of a small open world, where the open level area is not very large, but each and every object in it is carefully placed and thoroughly developed. Some places are mentioned or even vaguely described in dialogues or notes before you get there, which builds up the anticipation of that location for an attentive player. The game actually goes one step further, and instead of giving explicit information about some location further on the road, it provides the player with uncertain stories and incomplete pieces of data. Moreover, many locations convey their stories on their own. All you need to do is just to explore a location for some notes, audio messages and some less explicit suggestions, like bodies left in particular places in order to get a basic idea of what happened there. Thus, you might expect that pretty much any location is supplied with at least some sort of narrative incentive to explore it. Whether this incentive is connected to the anticipation of something heard previously, a revelation of something new, or both. The setting of the Metro franchise is an interesting amalgamation of science fiction and mystery. And since we're talking about the game, that's how the mystery part works in it. Basically, you just leave all the same elements of a game level to be there, but before the main character gets to see them, you provide the player with numerous mysterious legends about it. Inevitably, some of those legends would prove to be just fake stories, but some would appear to be true. This is a very cheap and resource-efficient way to harness players' own imagination to spice their game experience. If you simply walk into a dungeon and suddenly see a monster, this is a surprise, but this is a lost opportunity to engage your imagination. If prior to that I say to you, there is a monster in the dungeon, and then you walk and see it, there is almost no mystery to this. You just know it is there. The only room for imagination here is to wonder what kind of monster is that before you actually see it. But what if I say, there might be a monster in the dungeon? That adds a whole new level of mystery. because now you don't even know for sure whether it is there in the first place. That engages imagination a whole lot more. The true art of mystery is to provide a player with information that on the one hand sounds probable enough, but on the other hand the player has reasons to doubt it. And that creates the feeling of inner conflict and uncertainty that we appreciate in mystery. Let's take a look at the examples from the Metro Exodus. At the beginning of the level Volga, you know that there are some people in the church, but apart from that, you know nothing and left to wonder. Who are they and what are they up to? That's a very straightforward type of mystery, but in the level Yamantau, you are explicitly told that there is a shelter that survived the nuclear apocalypse and must be a safe harbor amidst the despair you've seen all around so far. But on the other hand, it sounds way too good to be true. And also prior to bringing you there, the game provides you with some doubtful clues and uncertain hints. Now you may start assuming that it might be a trap, but even so, what sort of a trap? Of course, I'm not going to spoil this here. Without this pre-built anticipation, your impression of the place would be much bleaker. Unfortunately, there are also some less successful examples from the game. In the chapter The Taiga, the player encounters a huge mutated bear called the Master of the Forest several times before the final showdown. In my opinion, the final encounter would have looked much more impressive if earlier you had seen only uncertain glimpses of the beast. Instead of that, pretty early in the chapter, you get quite a solid idea of the opponent that you will confront at some point. Also, I would say that the final confrontation in the Taiga level is somewhat redundant from the narrative perspective, but more of that later. To sum up the concept of a mystery in a computer game, your game usually is going to make some statements to the player. But before making those statements, it is a good idea to provoke some questions in the player's mind, so that those statements would not sound arbitrary, but instead would seem to be a natural answer to those questions. There is an interesting experiment made by developers at 4A Games not to include bosses at the end of some levels, particularly at the final level. Is it a good idea? Well, yes, if you manage to build up the necessary tension for the climax of the story by other means. In the final level of the Metro Exodus, the tension is created by the usage of dense horror scenes and is supported by the feeling of tension in the main story overall. The protagonist is desperate to find a specific medicine in order to save another character. All the while he has to wade through dark, sinister corridors full of virtually invincible enemies. The decision to abandon the final boss might be advantageous if near the end of a game a player has already a high level of build-up anticipation for the outcome. In this case, adding a boss at the end would create an unnecessary and even frustrating delay before the long-anticipated resolution is delivered, especially considering that a player may need multiple annoying attempts to defeat a final boss. Well, you might argue that in this case, the final boss fight just replaces one sort of tension with another, but I would say that it is better still when the gameplay pressure supports the narrative pressure, not replaces it. And that leads me to the final point. The final boss should be narratively justified. The boss should have a strong reason to be in this location and to impede players' intentions. Otherwise, it feels as if the final boss is just an artificial barrier to prevent you from reaching the outcome too soon. I would argue that the boss in the Taiga chapter mentioned earlier has no particular reason to attack the protagonist at the end of that level, especially after a stubborn fight you have with the same boss slightly earlier. So fighting it the second time is not as exciting anymore in terms of gameplay and serves to no particular purpose from the narrative perspective. However, I believe that Metro Exodus does a really good job without a final boss. At the end, the tension is already high, and there is no particular reason for a mutant to stand in the player's way. Yes, mutants hinder the player, but killing them would serve to no narrative purpose any better than just avoiding them. And avoiding mutants is exactly what the player does in the final level of the game. So to recap quickly, those are the 5 peculiar features of the narrative design in the game Metro Exodus. Different level types serve different narrative goals, and their alternating order prevents the player from getting bored or too exhausted. Open system of quests that makes the player more alert to the game setting and improves the feeling of immersion. Locations that are able to tell their own story and thus encourage exploration. Inner mythology that creates the feeling of mystery, while the absence of bosses in some chapters reminds us that a boss should not be an arbitrary obstacle, but the confrontation with one should resolve some conflict in the plot. Alright guys, if you're interested in more videos like this one, please let me know in the comments section. Also, I'm really curious about your opinions on points just mentioned. If the video was helpful or just interesting for you, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching, take care,